I have the honor to introduce our next speaker to you. Next up is Ethan Nadelmann. He is the founder of the Drug Policy Alliance and also of the podcast Psychoactive, and he will tell you his story.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Grateful for the organizers for inviting me. So I should say, I don't think I've ever been at a conference where I recognized so few people, which is a pleasure for me. So in giving, and I imagine that many of you have no idea what I've done or who I am, etc. So my presentation is going to be a bit autobiographical, but a way of talking about the evolution of the drug policy reform movement in the US and to some extent globally, and also how this psychedelic renaissance fits in, twists and turns within this broader drug policy reform movement. So let me just start, and as I say, this will be a bit autobiographical here, but over 40 years ago, as a graduate student, I was already using drugs and getting high and enjoying marijuana and psychedelics and trying other things. But the focus of my interests was US foreign policy and Middle East politics. And I'm fairly sure that I taught what was probably the first course ever taught at Harvard on Israel and the Palestinians back in 1982. And I already realized how horribly hopeless that situation might be. And so I was delighted to get involved in something so inspiring as drugs and drug policy, which at the time was very much a backwater issue. But I landed up being interested. I always thought the drug war was wrong, but I landed up doing all this research and on the internationalization of drug control and of criminal law enforcement. And I got a security clearance. I worked in the State Department's Narcotics Bureau. I wrote a classified report on drug-related money laundering. I went to 19 countries throughout South America and Europe interviewing DEA and Customs and FBI and CIA agents and foreign drug enforcement agents. I wrote a book, Cops Across Borders, on the internationalization of drug control. And I really, gave respect to those guys for doing what they did, studying what they did, but I knew that there was something fundamentally flawed. And as I was finishing my dissertation in 1987, the issue, which had been just a backwater drug policy, all of a sudden catapulted into the kind of media headlines in the United States and to some extent around the world. It was the launch of kind of the second great war on drugs. If Nixon was the first in the 70s, this was one that leapfrogged Nixon by many times under Reagan, under Bush, but also with ample bipartisan support from Democrats as well. Everybody was on board the war on drugs. Those of you know what McCarthyism refers to, McCarthyism, the period of hysterical anti-communism in the 1950s. This was in some respects like McCarthyism on steroids, where people were crazed, paranoid. It was the period of crack cocaine and crack-related crime and violence, and much of this was spilling over in Europe and other parts of the world as well. But in the United States, it was the onset of mass incarceration driven by the war on drugs. It was the spread of HIV/AIDS in many parts of the world being spread not through sexual conduct, but in fact through people using syringes to inject drugs and then sharing those syringes. It was like a crusade, and there was very little dissent. There were some academics and others standing up, and I, together with a few others, some prominent conservatives, the two most famous conservatives in America, the economist William Buckley and the conservative intellectual Milton Friedman, and then William Buckley, some academics, a few other brave ex-police chiefs, we sort of stood up and said, this is ridiculous, this is absurd, the war on drugs is doing more harm than good, we need to look at alternatives, we need to consider the decriminalization or legal regulation of at least some drugs. We were all instantly labeled the legalizers, regardless of whether or not we were right-wing libertarians or whether or not we were really pragmatic, reasonable people looking for a more pragmatic way of dealing with drugs. But for me, who had just started teaching at Princeton in 1987, teaching law and public policy, teaching drug policy, I all of a sudden was catapulted into a sort of, Andy Warholian 15 minutes of fame, and then a second one as well. And it gave me an opportunity to become, 35 years ago, the sort of leading speaker advocate out there, just as a movement was beginning to emerge in this area, right? And so I'm looking at this war on drugs, mass incarceration, marijuana, which had a brief period of liberalization in the 70s, rolling back where marijuana was being lumped into the whole thing, and psychedelics barely a tiny little side issue in all of this. And just kind of thinking, what has to come next here? What has to come next? Well, one thing I did, I had befriended Andrew Weil. And how many of you know who Andrew Weil is? Just raise your hands. Okay, you all should know who he is. He was really a pioneer, including in the psychedelics field. His book, The Natural Mind, and his next few books, Chocolate to Morphine, which is the best drug education book ever written, and then The Marriage of the Sun and Moon, a series of essays about altered states of consciousness. But The Natural Mind, a student of Schultes, who is at Harvard, one of the pioneering ethnobotanists. I mean, Andy was a mentor and inspiration for me. And in terms of thinking about why people use drugs, how people use drugs, why some people get in trouble with them. And then I remember there was a moment, and I'm going to weave in here my own psychedelic history here. I'd done mushrooms a fair bit in the early 80s and in my young 20s, and then 7 years had passed, and Andy used to do a conference about mycology. And mycology with the psychoactive element to it. In Telluride, Colorado. And he invited me to speak there and to share the stage with him, which was an honor. And then he gave me some mushrooms on the last day. And I remember, doing the mushrooms and picking up, kind of where I had left off my last experience 7 years ago, muttering conflict, feeling conflict in my life. And things began to resolve. And I'd been in the public eye for a couple of years. I was about to have a big piece come out in Science magazine about the war on drugs and its failures, which had a paragraph in there about psychedelics. And I realized that, it wasn't not an epiphany, more a concretization, that teaching about drugs was going to be my mission in life. And it didn't matter whether I stayed in academia or became an advocate, a journalist, a political figure, whatever, but that teaching about drugs was going to be my mission in life, and that in teaching about drugs, it would be a vehicle for speaking to broader issues around justice and equity and liberty in the broader society. And I remember going back and just feeling grounded in this, and in a way it was a blessing at this fairly young age to have this clarity about what my future was going to be, and in fact, I've never really looked back on that. Now, about a year later, I organized a working group. It's called the Princeton Working Group on the Future of Drug Use and Alternatives to Drug Prohibition. And I asked Andy and other distinguished academics to join. He suggested invite Sasha Shulgin, Sasha and Ann, because although he's been kind of behind the scenes, he's been radicalized by recent federal legislation, the Controlled Substances Analogs Act, which effectively criminalized all the work he was doing in his backyard laboratory. So Sasha and Ann came to that, and I befriended them, and they became an inspiration for me as well as a source of occasional other chemicals. I could always say I got my stuff from the source. And then, I've always had a lucky star hanging over me. And about 2 years later, I got a call out of the blue from a guy named George Soros. Now, some of you may have heard of him, a very wealthy philanthropist and money guy, but not quite yet famous, who had played a major role in the sort of the leading private philanthropist in bringing down socialist dictatorship in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. And he was intrigued by this issue, and we kind of hit it off. And as a result of that, I left the university and started up basically what was soon to become the leading advocacy organization in the United States, if not the world. First, I called it the Lindesmith Center, named after Alfred Lindesmith, the first leading intellectual to challenge conventional thinking about drugs and drug policy. It eventually became the Drug Policy Alliance, which at its height, became the leading organization in the US and the biggest one in the world, advocating for ending the war on drugs and for drug policies grounded in science, compassion, health, and human rights. But I'll tell you, there was a moment when I was first trying to come up with a name for the organization where I thought about calling it the New Amsterdam Center, both as a play on New York having once been called New Amsterdam in its earliest years, but also because part of the mission of the organization was to teach Americans about the more pragmatic and public health and harm reduction and human rights-based policies that one found in the Netherlands. Remember, the Netherlands had pioneered not just the decriminalization of marijuana beginning with the change of law here in 1976, but it also pioneered the needle exchange programs. The simple idea, recognizing that people were spreading HIV/AIDS not because they were using drugs, but because they were sharing infected syringes. And the whole basic idea of having a helping center where injecting drug users would come in and drop the dirty needle there, pick up a clean needle, what else can we help you with? Go out, try to stay safe, come back, do this. So the Netherlands was really a role model for me. And then shortly thereafter, countries like Switzerland, which pioneered on safe injection sites, basically needle exchange programs, with a nurse in the back so people could inject drugs safely, not on the street corners. And also the Swiss pioneering with heroin prescription programs so that people who could not quit using street heroin through either methadone or buprenorphine or 12-step programs could get legal pharmaceutical heroin, which is dramatically safer, and do that. And then Portugal, of course, which 20 years ago, began doing it, introduced the policy of all drug decriminalization. The basic idea that nobody should go to jail for simple possession of any drug whatsoever, and which has managed to sustain that policy and be a leader for the last 20 years. So part of my mission was to teach that in the US, but also try to spread that wisdom abroad. Now, Soros landed up contributing probably hundreds of millions of dollars to international harm reduction and drug policy reform around the world. I was able to bring in other wealthy donors to support this, able to engage politicians, most of our work in the US and elsewhere. But what was always important to me was not to get focused on one narrow area of drug policy. And so what evolved over a period of time was basically, as I built Drug Policy Alliance and as I kind of played advisory roles vis-a-vis the broader network of Soros Foundation and others getting into this area, roughly 1/3 of our work was on cannabis reform. First on the legalization of cannabis for medical marijuana beginning in 1996 in California, then on the decriminalization of possession, and then addressing the racially biased, very heavily marijuana arrest policies in the US, and ultimately the full legal regulation of marijuana beginning with Colorado and Washington in 2012, and then helping out in Uruguay in 2013, and then back in the US with other states, up to the point where you now know that 24 states in the United States with over half the US population now live in a place where marijuana is legal for adults. I mean, a really remarkable development. The second third of our work was really addressing the role of the drug war in mass incarceration, the second third of our work. And that was because the war on drugs was really the driving force behind the United States having this massive prison population. You go back 50 years ago, the United States incarceration rate was basically the same as what it is in Europe. It was kind of the global average. Right? But you fast forward, and we went from 500,000 people behind bars in 1980 to 2.3 million people behind bars by the early 2000s. With 5% of the population, we had over 25% of the world's incarcerated population. We had more people locked up on drug charges. We had more people locked up than China does, with 5 times our population. Right? I mean, the Russians were always in second place, huffing and puffing to keep up, but we left them in the dust when it came to mass incarceration. No democracy in history had an incarceration rate like the United States. And driving that was the war on drugs, with the number of people locked up going from 50,000 in 1980 to 500,000 just for violating a drug law, not counting drug-related crime and all of this sort of stuff. So finding the way to go from the war on drugs being the driving edge of mass incarceration in the United States and policies that we in the United States were promoting to the rest of the world, to having drug policy reform become the cutting edge of broader criminal justice reform so that we could begin to bring down the criminal population in the United States. That was the second third of the work. And the last third of the work was harm reduction, treating drug use and drug use and misuse as a health issue, not a criminal issue. Right? It was about needle exchange and access to sterile syringes to reduce AIDS. Then it became about addressing the overdose epidemic through making the drug naloxone available, or through Good Samaritan laws or other better education, about telling Americans about the European approaches on safe injection and heroin maintenance, about a sex education model for approaching drug education, right? The message to young people with drugs being, don't do it, but if you do, there's some things I want you to know, because my bottom line is your parent who loves you to death ultimately is not did you or didn't you, My bottom line is you're going to come home safely at the end of the night and grow up and make me healthy grandkids, right? That basic harm reduction approach. And then the last 10% was paying attention to the psychedelics issue, collaborating with my friend Rick Doblin, who he and I have been friends and allies for 35 years, and looking for little opportunities there. It was about taking on the issues of drug testing in the workplace and all the injustices associated with that, the issues of civil asset forfeiture reform. I won't get into it here in Europe. I don't think it's as big an issue. But it was about this broader movement. And part of what I took pride in, what I liked when we would do our biennial conference, which until MAPS just leapfrogged us 10 times over in Denver last June, was the leading gathering in the world of drug policy reformers. But I'd look out, and there would be somebody who was engaged in racial justice work on reducing incarceration, next to a person doing harm reduction in Vietnam with needles, next to a libertarian who wanted to legalize all drugs, sitting next to a law enforcement officer who thought the war on drugs was doing more harm than good, sitting next to somebody who had just been released from 20 years behind bars, gotten involved in prison ministry, and was now working to end the war on drugs, sitting next to a labor union person trying to organize a new emerging cannabis industry, sitting next to some psychedelicist, sitting next to somebody with hemp leaves in their hair thinking hemp will save the universe. It was the weave. It was the weaving everybody together. It was having people who were coming from one area of drug policy reform and had no idea the look of pleasure I would get when I would have somebody getting up on stage talking about the dramatic impact of an MDMA experience between two parents and their teenage daughter who was dying of cancer, and how MDMA had just transformed the relationship as death was approaching, and seeing the looks of the black and brown people in the audience dealing with mass incarceration being transformed by hearing drugs being talked about in that context. And other ones as well. People hearing about the coca growers in South America talking about coca in the same ways that we might talk about our plant medicines. The weave, right? It was the notion, I came up with a line years ago when I would finally say, so who are we? Who is the drug policy reform movement? We're the people who love drugs. We're the people who hate drugs. And we're the people who don't give a damn about drugs, but every one of us knows the war on drugs is doing more harm than good. It was understanding that the fundamental divide should not be among people based upon the relationship to drugs, whether those relationship was bad, good, or indifferent, but ultimately should be about them recognizing a commonality that dealing with all of these drugs, whether the relationship was positive or negative, was in fact being compromised by a harsh, punitive criminal justice mindset and set of policies. It was building a movement around all of that. Now, within this, just as I'm stepping down from running Drug Policy Alliance 7 years ago, this psychedelic renaissance starts to emerge. And I am excited on a personal level. There was never much for me to do at Drug Policy Alliance because we did ballot initiatives, we did referendum, we did legislative reform at the state and federal level, we did stuff in the courts, but there was relatively little we could do. I mean, there wasn't much, the public wasn't ready to go there. We even polled the issue. The prospects of what Oregon and Colorado did a few years ago was nowhere near to be seen. Rick was doing his work with FDA and trying to move this issue more broadly, but we didn't see the opportunity. But the psychedelics renaissance emerges, and I'd spoken at the first of the New York Psychedelics conferences called Horizons, at their very first one, giving a very, very, very early version of the talk I'm giving to you right now. But part of the critique became this psychedelics thing, these psychedelic exceptionalists, they're special drugs. They're looking down their nose at all the other drug users, psychedelic exceptionists who care only about liberalizing their own personal right to do these drugs, et cetera, et cetera. And I found myself talking to psychedelic groups, the few conferences that I went to, about the need to think more broadly, and talking to the groups around broader drug policy reform, racial justice, harm reduction, about the need to stay open. But I had to confess that I am a psychedelic exceptionalist. I am a psychedelic and cannabis exceptionalist, in the sense that of all the substances I've used, it's been the psychedelics and cannabis, which I've been using for the last 40 or 50 years, that have been good to me. and have been good in my life, and from which I've achieved inspiration, and which have been focused. And if I look at the greatest culinary experience, the greatest sunset, the greatest orgasm, some of the best intellectual ideas, psychedelics, mostly mushrooms in my case. So I love psychedelics, right? And I love cannabis, and I've always been a responsible user, never a daily user, and I've used the other substances well, and I've seen their benefits, and I recognize that, and I think it's important, I also know that from a societal perspective, that psychedelics and cannabis have the greatest benefit-cost ratio, that the upside is great. And there is definitely downsides to both these drugs, as various speakers have pointed out. We know the risks and the harms, and people can get devastated by their use of cannabis or by psychedelics, really devastated, and even sometimes lose their lives as a result of behavior associated with it. But from a broader societal perspective in virtually all of the world, the net benefit-cost ratio is dramatically greater than that with any other drug. But what I also know is I am not a psychedelic exceptionalist when it comes to the core principle. Because the core principle, not just in the psychedelics reform movement, but in the broader drug policy reform movement, is this. It's that nobody, but nobody, deserves to be punished for what we put into our bodies, absent harm to others. Nobody, but nobody, deserves to be discriminated against or amongst based upon the substance we put into our bodies, so long as we hurt nobody else. It means that for a parent who has two kids who, God forbid, one's an alcoholic and one's a heroin addict, there is no basis in the Bible and ethics and philosophy, you name it, and that says you treat one child differently than you treat the other one. That core principle, the one that in this field has been known as cognitive liberty, the broader idea of sovereignty of our own minds and bodies, one does not make an exception among people based upon the substance they are put in your body. That principle has to apply to the person who's doing fentanyl and methamphetamine the same as it does to the person doing ayahuasca or MDMA or mushrooms. That principle has to apply, that nobody deserves to be punished or criminalized simply for what you put in here. Now that doesn't mean that the policies will be the same. That doesn't mean that we will regulate methamphetamine or fentanyl or crack cocaine the same we would cannabis, or that we might do mushrooms or MDMA. The regulatory policies might well be different, but it's understanding at that core level there has to be a distinction there. Right? So that core principle drives me, and it needs to be something that I believe that this group particularly needs to pay attention to and be sensitive to. I'm always inspired when I find people in the psychedelics field who have come from a background of harm reduction, who have been engaged in helping people struggling with drugs, who have been engaged in those aspects of social justice, of public health, of really helping people in that regard, and who begin to see the integration of the work in that area and the work in this area, and not just in the sense of the value of psychedelics and helping people deal with their addiction and come to Jesus moment, or come to the realization of how they might improve their lives. Now, it's also important to realize that there are, of course, lessons and analogies when we look at the concerns around medicalization and commercialization, which is a major issue in the issue of cannabis. And full disclosure, I should say, I did join the board of a big marijuana company in the US a year ago, 6 years after stepping down. So I have, but I don't think that colors in any way what I'm saying here. Essentially, those issues are out there. And I am among those who am concerned, but not hyper-concerned about either. Why? If I look in the issue, I'll give you an example. If you ask the question, how do you explain the paradox, Ethan, that the United States, my country, which for almost 100 years was the global champion of the war on drugs, proselytizing and promoting our punitive prohibitionist policies all around the world, and our bilateral relations, our multilateral relations through the League of Nations, through the United Nations, how do you explain the paradox that the United States nonetheless became the global leader when it came to decriminalizing and legalizing cannabis, first for medical purposes, then more broadly leapfrogging what the Dutch did in the late 70s and 80s, and then stalled and just stalled and stalled while America jumped over them? And I'd say the only way to explain it is our focus on the medical marijuana strategy beginning in 1996 in California, and then in 6 other states thereafter, and then taking it nationally. Right? Why? Because what we did there helped to transform the imagery of who was a marijuana user. It began to transform the language around cannabis reform. It began to reassure people that marijuana was not just something that teenagers got fucked up on, but something that older people could do in a medical condition. And if it was okay for older people to smoke as their medicine, and to smoke as their medicine, not just take in a pill form or injection, then maybe we shouldn't be quite so concerned about those other elements. It allowed dispensaries to emerge, like coffee shops in the Netherlands, where people could be reassured that the sky will not fall if, in fact, we make marijuana more legal. We transformed something in an important way that was sensitive to the broader public perception. Right? It was about also learning in our advocacy that advocacy is not simply about standing up and saying what I believe, but that advocacy is in fact about using the words and the language that will help move the people whose minds might be open or even partially closed, because those are the people we need to move. One of my strong resistance to what I see some of my very young colleagues doing now of using the language of the left in so many different ways in order to advocate for social justice issues, I think is such a fundamental mistake, because it's important in advocacy, if you want to win, to use the language that speaks to the center and even the center right. That's pivotal. If you're not using a language that speaks broadly, you're not going to win. You stay in your little corner over here and you take pleasure in speaking your truth without ever actually changing something in the broader world. I think what Rick did with MAPS was so important. I think what Michael Pollan did with that book, that took this into the mainstream. People poo-poo at this and poo-poo at that, but in fact, it was transformative. When people could understand that psychedelics could have this medical value and that might be legitimized by corporate forces and major universities getting into it, my view was good. Because in what way does that undermine everything else that's happening? I think Lior said it earlier in the previous presentation. So that stuff's all happening, so it's getting medicalized, so it's getting corporatized. I don't like some elements, I don't like this sort of stuff. And when sometimes the corporate types try to suppress what's going on the other side of things, that's wrong and needs to be attacked. But to some extent, they removed a lot of the stigma from around these drugs as well. They provided less likelihood of being incarcerated, being punished, and this was true to some extent in the cannabis area, and even more so in the psychedelics area. But I'll tell you something else I learned. We have a tendency, because we're part of a movement that's a cutting edge, whether it's psychedelics reform specifically or drug policy reform more broadly, where we think we're enlightened. We think we're more enlightened than the average person. And you know, in many respects, maybe we are. But not in every respect. You know, I remember, back in the late 80s, early 90s, many of my progressive intellectual friends in the university elsewhere who bought into the stupidest of the drug war rhetoric because it was so dominant. They just went along with it. And so what I want to talk to you for the last couple of minutes is an issue which on its face has really just about nothing to do with psychedelics. But where I need to tell, I made a promise to myself that I'm going to speak about this issue in virtually every audience I speak to. And it's the issue of tobacco. And here I'm not talking about tobacco and shamanism, or the role of tobacco with ayahuasca, or we know tobacco as a psychedelic substance because that's a rich field. I am talking about the field of tobacco harm reduction. I am talking about this technological breakthroughs involving e-cigarettes and vaping and heated tobacco devices and now pouches and snus and things like this. And what's drawn me to this issue is that it reminds me of what drew me to the drug policy reform issue back in the 1980s. Part of what drew me to it was not just my own personal connection to cannabis and psychedelics, but it was the realization that the more deeply one studied this issue, the more you realize that the best way to deal with all psychoactive substances was to embrace a policy grounded in science and evidence and harm reduction and human rights. And that meant toleration for decriminalization. It meant allowing for this. Yet at that same time, the public, the media, and the politicians were all going the other way in terms of demonization, abstinence only, you name it. Well, the more I looked at this issue around tobacco, and I'm somebody, full disclosure, my dad died at the age of 58 and his pack-a-day cigarette habit probably played a role in killing him of a massive heart attack at that age. I hate big tobacco. I hate the cigarette companies. I hate smoking. I've never smoked a full cigarette in my life, right? But I realized, because I listened, that there's a fundamental difference between smoking a cigarette and nicotine. The vast majority of people believe, in my country, maybe even this one as well, that an e-cigarette or these heated devices, IQOS and others, are as or more dangerous than smoking cigarettes, when in fact they're roughly 90% less dangerous. The large majority of people believe, and this includes physicians, believe that nicotine causes cancer. Nicotine doesn't cause cancer. Nicotine is what hooks you, it's addictive, but what kills you is the tars and other burnt particle matters that are in it. What that means is that if tomorrow I could snap my fingers and all of the 1.1 billion people around the world who are smoking cigarettes were to suddenly stop and switch to vaping e-cigarettes or these heated tobacco devices or these pouches and snoozes and things like that, it would represent one of the greatest advances in public health in global history. What that means is that if that were to happen, and in fact, hundreds of millions of people who had never used cigarettes or were never going to use cigarettes began to vape e-cigarettes, etc., it would still represent one of the greatest advances in public health in human history because the relative risk to young people, I don't want them doing vaping, we don't want young people getting addicted to vaping, none of that, but that the harms to them compared to the benefits of adults stopping smoking by switching to these things if they can't otherwise switch was astronomical. I look now at the World Health Organization being firmly anti-tobacco harm reduction. I look at one of the biggest philanthropists in the world, Michael Bloomberg, spending hundreds of millions of dollars after having spent it wisely to reduce smoking, now spending it to oppose tobacco harm reduction, that switch. I look in this country at the Netherlands, a pioneer in harm reduction with illicit drugs, passing a law recently that's saying there should be no flavored e-cigarettes because they appeal to young children, ignoring the evidence that adults like the flavored products just as much as the kids do, that the flavored tobacco products actually help people smoke, help people quit smoking, and help people stop smoking. Ignore the evidence that most young people who vape never go on to smoke cigarettes. Now, my guess is that for some of what I'm telling you, it sounds, what? You got to be kidding me. I didn't know that. I didn't think that. Where are you coming from? Who are you representing? But the same thing that committed me to drug policy reform and harm reduction with respect to all of the illicit drugs makes me know, based upon the evidence, that what I am saying is right. And so what I'm saying, therefore, to this community is that when other issues emerge around other drugs, it's not just opening your heart and your minds to understanding how the principles of cognitive liberty and sovereignty over mind and body apply not just to the elevated substances, but to the less elevated, right? You know, in the United States, it's probably the one thing that's kept us honest until recently was our First Amendment of the Bill of Rights, right? The freedoms of speech, religion, press, and assembly. Right? That basically it protects not just elevated speech, but even atrocious speech, right? Up to, I mean, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. You can't sacrifice humans, because that's your religious belief. You can't organize a mob as part of the freedom of assembly. But by and large, we push that right to protecting not just the elevated, but to the less elevated, despicable. That the same has to be true in that core principle around drugs. But it also means extending that to understanding the one when we take the drug that today is one of the most demonized in the world, tobacco and nicotine, and it means understanding that one has an intellectual and a moral, and I would argue even a spiritual obligation to know that what you know is right about psychedelics also applies more broadly to this other broader area. I'm going to stop right there and leave you on that note and take any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ethan. There is a mic here and another mic there for people that might have questions. And I would like to remind you that a question is a short sentence with a question mark.
Hi. So you're quite open about where you get the source of your information from, and that you've
I'm sorry, I can't understand you.
You're quite open about using substances in the past. And from my experience, some people are less open about this, and they feel like it could be harmful to their professional career to be open about using substances.
Yeah.
And my question is, how would you recommend maintaining your professional stance while also being open and honest?
No, it's a great question. I mean, you know, because being a semi-public figure in this area means I've had to calibrate how I spoke about these issues for a long time, according to my judgment about what the public ear could hear and what the legal consequences would be. I also had to be, on the one hand, I didn't have to risk having an employer who just wouldn't understand. On the other hand, I did have wealthy, powerful people like George Soros and other philanthropists who didn't want me getting so far out there that it might embarrass them. And so I'll say it really varied. At the height of the drug war in the late 80s, I went through a period of paranoia. I did not get high with any new person, smoke a joint, for the first few years. If a journalist asked me, did I smoke marijuana, I might be cute, and I would say a line, I can't say that I have. I can't say that I have, which can be taken different ways. Legally, I can't say it, or however you want to take it. I might play around with speaking in the past tense, or the present tense, or what's that thing between the past and the present? I can't remember my grammar anymore. So when we use terminology, so it really was a matter of calibrating. On the psychedelics thing, it was once again a sense of finding when was the right moment. I remember for me, I think it was at our biennial conference in LA, it must have been about 12, 13 years ago, and I came out, essentially, in a public forum that was video. And I remember saying, the way I framed it actually, was I said, I think psychedelics are mostly wasted on the young. I think actually psychedelics is part of a healthy aging process. And I said, I'm Jewish. Once a year, on Yom Kippur, the Jewish holy day, I fast. I don't no food or water for 25 hours because I think it's kind of good for the soul and the ritual. And I say that's sort of the way I feel about psychedelics, that I think that people, as they age, that at least once a year should engage in a psychedelic experience because it's good for stirring up the emotional and spiritual and physical sediment in our lives. And that's a good thing to do that people get afraid to do as they get older and their lives are full of compromises and disappointments, but that it's a good thing to do. Ram Dass's old line, I think, was it Ram Dass, Rick? If you got the message, hang up the phone. And my view was, okay, but then pick it up once in a while, but I think it was about calibrating that thing. I think we are in a period now where more and more people use, so my basic view is push the envelope. Be courageous but not reckless. Don't lose your job over this. Be sensitive. One of the greatest costs is if you have children, what are the parents of your children's friends going to think and say? And will that compromise? So there are tricky issues around that, apart from one's employer or whether or not one can get a government job. But I think the key is be courageous but not reckless. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Thank you for a very passionate speech. I get the sentiment that in Europe we're lacking some of that passion, so I'm just going to ask you two questions. First of all, who's the Ethan of Europe and who's the Ethan of the Netherlands in your mind?
That's a good question. It's funny because this issue of speaking with part of this is my father was a rabbi. He spoke the way I do. I kind of assimilated that way of speaking from him, and I think it's a good way of speaking, and I don't like to use slides, just like focus on what I'm saying here, guys, right? And it's important to speak out. But it's funny, sometimes when we would have our biennial conferences in the U.S. and roughly, 80% of the people there, 85% would be from the U.S. and 15% would be from other countries. And I would say, how many of you are from the West? And people go, yeah, I'm from the West. How many are from the East? Yeah, I'm from the West. How many are you from the middle? Yeah, how many are from outside the U.S.? I am. There's not that tradition of kind of speaking and being passionate that way. But I'm not sure in terms of the figures politically who have done it. I know in certain countries there have been, I think of Alex Wodak in Australia has been a key figure. I think at various times in other countries, there have been people who have stood up and, but the broader area, this drug policy reform field is, it's one of the problems of drug policy reform is that for many years, our progress in any one area of drug policy reform depended upon that particular area disassociating itself from broader drug policy reform. So we advanced on medical marijuana by calling it about medicine and about AIDS and about things like that, not about marijuana legalization. We advanced on needle exchange, not as drug policy reform, but as HIV prevention, right? Some people in the psychedelics field, where it was very important to them to disassociate from the broader drug policy reform movement. One thing I've always loved about Rick Doblin and MAPS is he always, not just did he use a model of psychedelics reform grounded on the broader drug policy reform model, but he always perceived psychedelics reform as part and parcel of broader drug policy reform. So I think what you have is you had individuals who played powerful roles in individual areas. But I'm trying to think about, I don't know that there are other people who play, I think in the international harm reduction field, people like Kasia Malinovska or Daniel Wolf or Martin Jelsma is a Dutchman who's played important roles. So they're here and there, including in the developing world as well. But it's hard to give a more specific answer to that. Yes?
Very short, we have 20 seconds left.
First of all, thank you for your very inspiring talk. Your energy is so contagious. I feel like we can move a tower right now. But I wholeheartedly agree with destigmatizing any type of substance use. But how can we balance the thing of destigmatizing but not normalizing any kind of substance use that it becomes to this?
Yeah, I mean, my basic view on the issue of stigmatization is, and in this respect, I'm somewhat conservative, and more conservative than my more conservative allies, which is to say, I don't think any form of substance, any drug whatsoever, can be used in a way that is non-harmful and even productive. It's not just psychedelics, it's even the most powerful opiates and stimulants. That said, I still believe in the principle that people need to be held responsible for their actions. And that saying, oh, but I'm addicted, and that's why I hit that person over the head for their money, people need to be held responsible. Their punishment may vary because both they and society may benefit from not locking them up, but the principle of personal responsibility has to be combined with the principles of personal responsibility and a compassionate perspective from the broader society. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.